All right. I think we might get started and hope that a couple more people join us as we get going. So welcome everyone to this session about integrating environmental ethics and religious perspectives into carbon dioxide removal assessment. A little bit of an overview of how we're gonna do this session. It's a little bit different to some of the other sessions that have been happening during the Assistant Governance Forum this week. We, you might have noticed, for those of you who are coming online, we're doing it as an open meeting, meaning that all of the participants can turn on their camera and have a chat with us. We wanted to make it a little bit more of an interactive roundtable discussion rather than a series of presentations with Q&A, just because we think this kind of topic is more conducive to sort of more interactive format. The way we're going to do it is I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction to the topic, although I think most people who are online probably have a bit of an overview over it already. And I'm going to give you a little introduction. Then we're going to have a brief round of introductions. Given that we also only have a couple of non-presenting participants, I might also invite the participants to tell us who they are if they feel comfortable doing that. So that we all, get to know each other a little bit if we don't already know each other. So round of introductions with name, affiliation, and how you're connected to this topic, or what interests you about this topic, or what work you're doing in relation to it. And then we've got a set of discussion questions, which you can see here, which we're going to, among the panel of people who prepared for this, are going to have a brief roundtable discussion of these questions. And then we're going to invite the audience members to also join us and ask other questions and take the conversation a little bit further. So that's the general plan of attack for the next 90 minutes or so. So just to give a bit of a brief overview of the topic. So those who are on the call likely know that the idea of deliberately removing CO2 from the atmosphere and permanently storing it either in geological formations or in biomass or in other ways, permanently removing it from the atmosphere is becoming more and more a topic that's being discussed in international climate policy circles and is becoming integral to understandings of how we're going to achieve net zero emissions and potentially after that achieve net negative emissions to draw down more CO2 than we're emitting in the future to try and compensate for legacy emissions. So these discussions have been sort of picking up speed since the IPCC started raising the issue more urgently after the 1.5 degree report was released. So and the a lot of these proposals for trying to remove CO2 from the atmosphere are quite novel and new and involve biological processes and engineered processes and chemical processes. They take place in very different environments and affect very different groups of people. And they also imply different ways of interacting with our natural environment and with the global climate. And so they require really diverse knowledge types to think about and to assess. Should we do this? Can we do this? How can we do this? What does this mean for humanity to do this kind of large scale, deliberate removal of CO2 from the atmosphere? And so there's, of course, been a lot of scientific discussion, natural sciences, social scientists, lawyers, economists, increasingly philosophy and ethics becoming involved in the discussion. And we also think that's the premise for this conversation, that as global systems of knowledge and practice world religions and spiritual traditions could provide frameworks that are also relevant because they are systems of knowledge that societies have historically drawn upon to understand sort of moral and ethical questions related to humanity's role in and responsibility towards nature and sort of religious, even if we don't realize it, perhaps religious beliefs and practices can be inherently um, or indirectly influential on how we approach cultural issues and social organization. So it can be argued that religion may have a role to play alongside other forms of knowledge and knowing in these sorts of environmental discussions. So in this session, we want to, invite discussion on how insights from religious perspectives can complement and build upon or contrast with existing environmental ethics categories and criteria being developed to assess the feasibility and desirability of implementing carbon dioxide removal. So those of us, a couple of us in the room here, are working on assessing CDR from a very interdisciplinary perspective, integrating socially relevant, ethically informed desirability criteria into sort of a holistic assessment of CDR proposals. And we're interested in how religious questions and narratives might contrast with or be complementary to some of these environmental ethics discussions. How bringing together these alternative perspectives could help shape understanding, assessment, and governance of carbon removal. So that's sort of to set the scene a little bit for the discussions today. And we've got a great group of people here who have backgrounds in environmental ethics and various religious perspectives on environmental issues. And I'd like to invite them to introduce themselves to you. So Sarah, could I call upon you first to just give us a little bit of an overview of yourself, who you are, what you do, and how you're connected to this issue?
Sure, I'd be happy to do so. Miranda, I'm wondering if it would make sense to pull the screen share down so we can see each other more.
Yes,
Is
I
that
have done
okay?
so.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Fredericks. I'm a faculty member at the University of Chicago Divinity School. Um, I'm a scholar of environmental ethics. My research has intersected with this conversation in a couple of different ways. One, my first major project was on the ethics of sustainability indicators, which I think shares a lot in common with questions raised here about the ethics of CDR assessment. And I've also worked some on how religious perspectives in general can contribute to conversation about geoengineering. So I'll pass it on to somebody else.
Thanks, Sarah. Then we'll go on to Claire.
Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see some familiar faces and to meet some new ones and to meet some new people. My name's Claire Hayward, and I'm a professor of philosophy at UiT Arctic University of Tromsø. I've been engaged in this debate for quite a lot longer than I'd care to admit. I trained in political philosophy, and after that, and my first postdoctoral fellowship was on the then called the Oxford Geoengineering Programme, where I became acquainted with the topic, having done a PhD on having done my thesis on climate justice generally. So I've got quite a background in this. So I've got a kind of like a veteran's perspective on some of this debate, as well as I see a couple of other veterans here as well. My Just one thing about the term environmental ethics, I'd like to say. I don't do environmental ethics in the kind of like the narrow sense, but Miranda's knows knows what I'm going to say about this. In the narrow sense, where I haven't done so much research on ideas of intrinsic value or relational values or anything like that. I've taken questions of climate change, CDR, SRMs technologies from a kind of like a political philosophy perspective, but that is certainly a normative perspective. I'm happy to learn more about environmental ethics and religious ethical perspectives as well. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Claire. Yeah, no, sorry for mislabeling you there. Then we would go on to Willis, please.
Hi, everyone. I am Willis Jenkins. I'm a professor of ethics at the University of Virginia, where I'm also the chair of the Department of Religious Studies, although I was hired to do environmental humanities here. So I work across fields and especially in science-humanities interactions. My background research was originally on Christian theologies and environmental thought. Now I think more broadly about how religion, whatever that might be, in various different kinds of senses, interacts with environmental perceptions, and especially I have a long-running research project on the Virginia coast.
Great, thanks, Willis. Then Lucas.
Yes, hello everyone. Good afternoon or almost good evening. It feels in autumny northern Germany. I hold a postdoc position at Kiel University in Germany and have a background in climate ethics. Have quite like Claire worked on climate ethics more broadly during my PhD, and then the first real postdoc position now is in the field of climate engineering and more specifically on CDR. I'm part of a bigger and German research project that will, I guess, also feature when Lieske and Miranda will introduce themselves, called ASMASIS, part of a bigger research mission, CDR Mare. And ASMASIS is tasked with developing an assessment framework for CDR. And as Miranda already hinted at, this assessment framework, not only like most existing assessment frameworks, covers questions of feasibility, where environmental ethics, maybe ethics more generally, normative perspectives maybe don't have that big of a role to play, but also desirability. And that's where issues not exclusively of environmental ethics, but also issues of environmental ethics, at least we think so, creep in or should be part of it. And hence, yeah, we developed an assessment framework that's about to be published soon, we hope, where we grappled with these questions about, okay, which ethical perspectives to include in such an assessment framework that should be a tool available for many users and not just for us, certainly. So it can't just be our own idiosyncratic ethical ideas, has to be somewhat broader. Do we stay secular? Are religious perspectives included somehow directly or indirectly? So yeah, the environmental ethics question definitely was one that featured and continues to feature prominently in our discussions there, and the relevance of more religious viewpoints is featured briefly, and I guess will feature also more prominently in the future. Yeah, looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Lucas. And then Lieske, would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone, and thank you, Lucas, for already introducing the project ASMASIS, where we work together. So I'm also a postdoc researcher in that project. My name is Lieske Fouquet-Clichin. I have a background in environmental ethics, narrowly conceived, as Claire just said. So I kind of came from environmental ethics into climate ethics. And yeah, well, I guess my interest in the religious perspectives is that I think that some arguments that pop up if you ask people, well, what do you think is relevant in CDR from an environmental ethics perspective, are quite difficult to kind of pinpoint from an environmental ethics perspective. And they have a hope or an inkling that religious perspective can help to kind of capture this kind of arguments. And also personally, I grew up in a Protestant parsonage, so that brings some kind of personal interest in the relation between philosophical arguments on the one side and religious perspective from the other. Thank you. Miranda,
yes, I realized. Sorry. Thank you very much. That's all our panelists, and we have the grand total of 3 audience members. Given that it's only such a small group, if you feel comfortable with introducing yourselves, that would be great. Chris, did you want to say something?
Okay, Chris Vivian. I'm currently co-chair of Working Group 41 of GAZEM, which is looking at ocean interventions for climate change management, most of which are CDR, but there are some albedo techniques as well. My background was I'm retired currently, and I retired from CFAS, which was the UK government's marine environment fisheries agencies, back in 2016. And since that time, I've been doing that GAZEM project that we mentioned, and part of that is developing an integrated assessment framework for these ocean intervention techniques. And that's something that some of you will be aware that the London Convention, London Protocol have been developing some governance ways of dealing with these techniques, and there's some ongoing work in that area currently. They developed some assessment framework for ocean fertilization some years ago, back in 2010, and they're now looking at 4 other additional techniques, 2 of which are CDR and 2 of which are albedo techniques. And Miranda and Claire are both involved in that working group, I should say, as well.
Yes, we're a very incestuous crew here. Thanks, Chris. All right, Johanna, Joanna, would you like to say hi?
Sure. I didn't know I was going to look like a ghost. I promise you I'm quite real. I have kind of multiple roles, but interesting for this group, I am studying Charlotte Mason, who is, I wonder if Willis knows who she is at all. She's very popular among Christian home educators in the US, but I'm actually at the University of Cumbria in Northwest England, where she had her base and died in 1923. And so my work is largely around applying her ideas to private governance of the SDGs and how we rethink sustainability leadership. But the university itself is a cathedral school group, and I'm working for the Vice Chancellor also to overhaul our sustainability vision and plan, and trying to kind of think how we can use her ideas as an Anglican educationalist who's been a bit co-opted by the evangelical far right in the US, but whose ideas are very relevant for thinking about how we understand the environment and for citizenship, and how we as a university can still use them as part of our heritage and as we plan towards our perspective on sustainability. So, and I write and publish in religious ethics, largely using her ideas to think about supply chains, actually. But I'm very excited to listen to you all today.
That's really interesting. Maybe later we can talk a little bit more about religious perspectives on supply chains, because that's something that I've never seen together in one sentence, but it makes sense. That's very interesting. Thank you. Diana, I'm not sure if you are online or if you'd like to say hi. No pressure if you don't. That's fine. She's letting us know in the chat. I'll read it out. She says, sorry, I'm not able to speak, but I'm a journalist from the US who writes about religion and climate change. I'm working on a few stories about CDR. Great. Thanks for joining us, Diana. We're not just talking to ourselves, but we also have some externals to enliven the conversation a little bit. Although, of course, we always enjoy exchanging ideas on this among ourselves as well. Thanks for joining us. All right, let's jump right in. So for those listening in, you guys, we just ask you to sit this one out for a moment, and then there'll be a chance for us to open up the conversation after we have a discussion among the panel members. So for the next 20 to 30 minutes, we're just going to chat among ourselves, and you can listen. And then there'll be a possibility to engage directly. And I'd ask you, if you do have a question, to chuck a exclamation part. Yes, that's the thing. Claire, you already have a question, or are you just demonstrating?
I do have a question, if I may.
Yeah.
It's point of order.
Yeah.
I'm sure I'm sure I've just forgotten, but I would just like to check whether this meeting is Chatham House or what the public or whether we can be quoted. I don't know if there's been I can't remember what the policy was.
Well, it's being recorded, so I'm pretty
Yeah.
sure that it's going on the website.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's grand. Just checking.
Yeah, that's so. I'm pretty sure we're a completely open book.
Right.
Just so
Okay.
that you know.
Good.
Yeah, and Claire has
Thank
already
you.
demonstrated how this works. We put a question, like an exclamation mark in the chat when someone would like to say something, so that then I know the order of who wants to say what. But given that we're such a small group, I don't think it's as important as it would be if we had a larger audience. All right, so let's jump right in. Among our panelists, you don't have to do your exclamation mark. You can just jump in and start talking whenever you feel like it, to just keep it a little bit dynamic. So let's start off just with a very general question. We already touched on this a little bit in our introductions, but why is it, or is it important? And if it is, why is it important that ethical and religious perspectives are brought into CDR assessment debates? Who'd like to kick us off with a bit of an overview of why they think this is important?
Maybe from I can start.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, and I will start, I guess, with the environmental ethics part, and someone else can chime in for the religious part. So I think there are assessments of CDR that can do perfectly well without it. It always depends, like, which assessment question are you asking towards CDR? So if you stay like perfectly within a feasibility assessment, or maybe just a technical feasibility assessment, then I'm not sure, like, whether any ethical or environmental ethic questions really have to feature. But if you want to go for something broader, and especially if you want to know something like, would this really be a good idea? What speaks in favor of it and what speaks against it being a good idea? Then you have to just open yourself up to normative considerations, to like, how do certain CDR technologies, CDR projects, could be asked on different levels, affect, well, the things we value, our norms, how they affect the rights. And I don't necessarily mean legal rights, but maybe moral rights of various subjects. And even if you do that, maybe you don't necessarily have to go into the environmental ethics direction, but insofar as if you do a purely human-centered analysis, you may very well have to look at environmental effects, but only insofar as they affect humans. But as soon as you say something like, well, I think things matter beyond the purely human sphere in the end, and not just for humans, but in some sense in and of themselves, then I think you're knee deep, and for good reasons, in a discussion about environmental ethics. And you can do such things through the back door, like not really making it transparent, not really making it explicit, that you ask these questions because, well, ultimately you care maybe about animals, about biodiversity, ecosystems, whatever. But we think by far the preferable way is to do that through the front door and to be transparent about that. Yeah, maybe just so much.
Thanks, Lucas. Who'd like to build upon that and bring in an alternative? Go ahead, Sarah.
Thanks, Lucas, for starting this off. I agree with a lot of what you said, and I'm excited to hear about it. I'm a little bit wary of the idea that a feasibility assessment doesn't involve values. My guess is that there are a number of values baked into assumptions about what could be feasible. And so I'd push to say that ethics is probably embedded in this from the beginning. But I definitely agree with you that bringing it in explicitly is important. I'd add that this, from my perspective, is important when we're thinking about not just humans, but as you said, other species or ecosystems. I also think it's really important when we're thinking about differential effects or participation in decision-making among groups of humans, So for example, might there be sacrifice zones where certain people bear more of the brunt of certain kinds of deployment of various CDR techniques, etc.? And I view all of these kinds of questions as questions of ethics. I'd say broadening to religion, recognizing that ethics could be stemming from religious viewpoints or potentially secular viewpoints. I'd say that religions, broadly speaking, also give an orientation to the world, including views of what it means to be human. For example, are humans fallible? Do we have limits? Are there possibilities of us changing and making things better? And I think some of those fundamental assumptions about human limits and possibilities deeply guide what we think when we're working with CDR or geoengineering in general. And bringing those perspectives to bear and acknowledging them, I think, can help us examine differences of opinion about such new possibilities, and also where we might have problems in the future. And then finally, I would say that religions as existing entities and the academic study of religion brings something to CDR assessments insofar as they push us to think about communities and relationships, that the ethics are embodied in communities of practice. And I think that that shapes how we think about decision-making and implementation. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Does someone else want to jump back in on this question?
I'd like to come in a little bit, if that's okay, Miranda. So I agree with what's with the previous with Lucas to some degree, and also I also agree to some extent with Sarah when she said about how normative considerations can sometimes come into feasibility studies. There's there are value judgments made in decisions about risk. There are value judgments made. There are some kinds of judgments made in judgments about feasibility as well. What I'd like to mention is a particular. I was trying to think. I do kind of political philosophy and moral philosophy from a I'm from a secular standpoint, and also I'm an atheist, and so I started to think, well, what would be the what kinds of things can religious perspectives add to the kinds of assessments that to some of the kind of like the secular work in environmental ethics, and one of the and when I was thinking about this, I remembered that it's religious doctrines, as Sarah said, have a kind of like a they have long traditions. They're the first. A lot of them constitute the kind of like the first. Some the first kind of like serious attempts to think about the big questions about humans, humans' places in the world, and relationships with each other and with non-human communities. So certain religious ideas are still kind of present, even if we want to do kind of like secular in environmental ethics. I'm not sure really that we could actually avoid doing religious. I'm not sure if we have a kind of like purely secular environmental ethics. The other thing, which is probably an advantage compared to some of the kinds of to the particular type of secular moral philosophy that I do, is that it's obviously important. I think it's important for people to debate political issues, including marine CDR and any kind of response to climate change, in kind of like a language that they understand. To use concepts that are familiar, that they recognise, and often these are used have come from our religious traditions. So so appealing to religious ideas can make these things seem more can make them more understandable. They're more relatable. There's religious values often can be communicated through stories, for example. They have a kind of like a more distinctly kind of like human touch. For example, even as an atheist, I can remember at least I can remember several Bible stories and parables, but I'd be really hard pushed to remember more than two variants of the trolley problem. They kind of they can bring. It brings religious texts can really kind of like bring these issues to life in a way that perhaps secular or more secular approaches cannot.
May I briefly add to that? Thank you, Claire. I really think it's important to recognize that we should question if we have such a thing as a secular ethic. And also, I think that perhaps it might be helpful to relate to religious perspectives, because in these perspectives, certain arguments or concepts that we invest are much more explicit. So, for example, Sarah spoke about humans being fallible. And I think this is something that might kind of sit behind arguments such as does CDR express something like hubris, or is it something like playing God? So notions about what it means to be human and that humans are fallible might be something motivating at least some people to develop such arguments. And it's much easier to recognize such notions from a religious perspective, because in a lot of ethical arguments, we try to abstract away a lot because we are in a pluralistic society, political liberalism and all that, and religious perspectives allow us to explicitly have a look at those notions. And I think that's something that is very helpful for both the kind of societal discourse, but also for the academic ethical discourse.
Thanks very much, Liske. Willis, did you want to come in here?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I think if I can offer my way of thinking about various uses of the terms religion, because the different, we've already had some reflection on, what might religion mean and how might that differ from or overlap with ethics. And so when I'm asked about religious perspectives on environmental change, like once the IPBES, you say IPBES, they reached out and asked for 200 words on how religion matters for biodiversity loss. Oh gosh, here are I try to discriminate this. So 5 different basic uses of the term religion or religious. One is official teachings, doctrines, statements from representatives, usually in relationship to the the so-called world religions, but maybe also minority religious traditions. Laudato Si, everyone's favorite example from Pope Francis, would be one example of that. That's that may be different from how people who understand themselves to be members of a tradition actually think or practice or value, and so sometimes religion scholars focus on that instead. how, I think Sarah's term was communities of practice, like what is this specific community of practice? How do they think or act in a way that matters for this? And on those first two senses of religion, for CDR, there's probably not a lot of explicit teaching or thought about CDR, but there are views that of course matter for, risk perception. That's different from a third way that we can use religion, which is to refer to maybe spiritual experience or religion-like experiences, especially in this case involving the ocean. So senses of awe or mystery or wonder that people may have when they interact, or even, there's some work on nature-based spiritualities involving the ocean, like surfing as a kind of spiritual approach to a life, Many people in this view, they're not going to consider themselves religious, but they have, these deeply shaped experiences involving the ocean that will, again, shape how they think about technological interactions with it. A fourth sense would be, again, a number of you have mentioned it already, the way that long cultural inheritances shape the conversations that we have, the terms of our debate. So this would be the histories of our terms or values or the stories that we have. So for example, the sense of the ocean as a symbol of purity or as a symbol of chaos, right? Like those are big religious stories behind both of those. And they may shape how non-religious people and institutions think about interacting with oceans. And then finally, we might think about Anthropocene challenges broadly. CDR, Ocean CDR, a great example of it, as involving religion-like complexity in its relations. And I think this is how I would think about what Sarah just mentioned about views of the human, right? About, well, do we think about how do we think about human limits, human fallibility? What do we think about an appropriate view of humans in relationship to nature or the cosmos? Again, it may not be informed by a specifically designated religious view, but you might think of something that has a cosmological entailments like that as being, functionally religious in some way. So 5 different ways, and I would just say how religion matters for CDR differs for each different use, but really broadly and generally across them. One reason I am so interested in this field of research is because I think it's a matter of more or less procedural or epistemic justice, allowing and inviting people to participate in these dramatic negotiations of human relationship with their environments with their own first vocabularies of value. So without having to translate that into like an approved vocabulary of value.
Great. We're already delving into some of the really big questions here. Liska, go ahead. Yeah.
Just a brief add to that. I think that sometimes people who identify or feel as members of a religion have more of such a vocabulary than people who do not identify as members of a religion, because they have some kind of, I know that religions are not in themselves consistent all over, but at least they have some kind of body of vocabulary, while people in pluralistic societies might not feel they have such a body of vocabulary that they can draw on and that other people will understand. And that might also be something that religions can bring into a secular discourse. I'm not saying religion is only important for the secular discourse, but I was looking in preparing for this session for things where I think religion, besides its own importance, can also bring things to the secular discourse. And I think that bringing in such vocabulary and meaning can be something.
Do you have some concrete examples of what you mean, Liska, just to make it a little bit more understandable for me, what kind of vocabulary you're
well, coming back to what I mentioned earlier, speaking about humans as fallible, and therefore explaining why you think that CDR might be problematic just because of its scale or because of the intention of intentionally changing the climate, why people think that's a strange or a concerning idea. So that would be one. The idea or the notion of sin might be something, though that's quite difficult to kind of translate into a secular discourse, but still, if people have very ingrained feelings that something is wrong or that we bear a certain sort of guilt for climate change and therefore need to do things, and CDR might either feel quite right in that regard or very wrong. Things like that. Does that make it more meaningful for you? Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I'd like to come back to this sort of in relation to the role of humans in the world. Everyone touched on it a little bit, like these understandings of that come maybe from religious understandings, but also secular understandings, maybe influenced by religious understandings of what's humanity's role in relation to the natural environment, separate from, part of, responsible for, all of these things. Maybe we can dig into this a little bit more. I know that a few people in the room have thought a little bit about this, like how does CDR relate to these worldviews and the role of humans envisioned in various religious traditions?
I mean, I can give it a go. So yeah, Lieske and I, with a colleague of ours, actually writing on a paper on that right now. And I think one thing to keep in mind here is that like every individual CDR project, unless of gigantic scale, will not be like a world-changing thing in a big way, right? But CDR overall as a strategy may very well be that. So it is sometimes thought to be like a giant and in a way novel way of interacting, of humanity interacting with the natural world by intentionally altering it in its very foundations, the climate system being foundational for essentially lots of natural processes. And why is that novel? Why don't we do that with climate change already? Because climate change, by and large, we're not doing intentionally. Knowingly by now, but not intentionally. And the idea is that altering the world, broadly speaking, intentionally is something that comes with its own class of moral problems. And whether that is a plausible position is something we're currently writing on, and I think is something where like different perspectives, some like perspective from environmental ethics and also different religious perspectives will, I imagine, have wildly diverging views on.
Yeah. I also did during my PhD a series of interviews with religious green activists or people who were involved in environmental issues, but also religious issues. Yeah, I found this big tension when it comes to the idea of deliberately intervening into natural systems between this sort of God-given responsibility to be a steward or to mold nature to support humanity in its development, and then this other sort of socio-ecological embeddedness within a system. Everything is of God or was created by God, and so this different, being part of an interconnected whole. So there's sort of these two connected but interrelated understandings of humanity's role in the natural world. So on a spectrum between those things, and I mean that's of course leaving out some others that maybe I didn't cover when I talked to these religious representatives, but definitely gave a very different perspective on, are you a gardener of the earth, or are you actually part of the garden and you need to care for it in a humble and reciprocal way, because you are it and it is you in a way. So that was very interesting. But I'm meant to be moderating and not talking. So Johanna has put in the chat, by identifying a secular discourse, we also exclude contexts by which by their nature are religious context for CDR. Different countries, all of those policy debates by their nature are spiritual, religious. Where do these secular discourses exist? and how are they resistant of pluralism through their dominance, especially in academic contexts. I'm also happy to already open up the discussion to, even though we have such a small group, to discussing questions from not on our list. Does anyone feel they would like to speak to this question? Sarah, please go ahead.
Yeah, can I go back? I think Johanna has a great question, and I'd like to just ponder it for a moment. But I'd like to
Yeah, of
add
course.
something based on the question about that we had been talking about. One thing that I am interested in regarding religious contributions to CDR assessments is we've talked some about the ethical evaluation of and building up of the assessment. I'm also curious about what happens when and if CDR is deployed. And are there ways that, and I think that there are, that a variety of different religious traditions can help people make sense of that type of action, the responsibility that humans are taking on, the possible challenges, the unforeseen consequences, and also the moral emotions involved in that. As somebody earlier mentioned, the possibility of feeling guilt or shame. I know that grief is something that can really come up in these conversations. Maybe people think that CDR is necessary, but they wish it wasn't. And so how do they wrestle with those kinds of challenges? Do they feel joy that they're able to do some kind of technological advance? I don't know, but I think that religions have experience in dealing with moral emotions in communities to support people through various challenges that they experience. And so I think when we look to religion as resources, whether they're traditional religions or, as Willis mentioned, religious-like or new religious movements, say in surfing communities or environmental activist communities that have practices that look like religion to religion scholars, I think we open up possibilities of responding to CDR in a really multifaceted way across dimensions of human experience.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah. Would anyone like to build on that idea or come back to the question that Johanna had posed?
I'll say something briefly to that. Sarah, you made me smile when you said things that look like religion to religion scholars, because to religion scholars, sometimes everything looks like religion after a while, and we're good at that. I think your point is great, and Miranda, I like the question. I guess for scholars and people who are watching from all different disciplinary perspectives, like meaning is going to be made out of CDR or its lack, right? And some of that meaning will happen in ways that are usefully analyzed as religious, and we should track it. And I am warm to the suggestion that religious communities have interpretive resources that will help people make sense of moral emotions. And I also would just give a word for the other side too. I mean, for I guess maybe a less benign view, there will be, no matter what happens, from best to worst cases, there will be moralizations of what humans are doing or not doing that use religious ideas. And I think anyway, there's that's what will happen, undoubtedly. And I just want to. There's not a great segue into the second thing I want to say here, but that is, I am personally interested in the way that geoengineering broadly and ocean CDR specifically might track with evangelical Christian U.S. views that have been, really reluctant towards any kind of climate action. Well, there's some evidence that they might be much more interested if there are technologically interventionist ways in which humans can kind of manage things. Like that just kind of fits better with the broader worldview. I'm not saying that in a predictive sense, but it's an interesting question to check.
Could you just briefly elaborate on like what feature of these technical interventions tracks maybe so well with their worldviews?
What feature? Yeah, okay, that's a good question too. So I meant that in a kind of vague way, and Sarah may know more about this. But I haven't made a like deep study of this, but I have just noticed in, I guess, popular religious culture, that there are voices from evangelical world broadly that are they show some interest in this has been mainly like solar radiation management kind of things, like dramatic interventions in the sky, and like, oh, that's the kind of thing that humans should do, right? That looks like dominion, right? Like we could do that. We could be interested in that with the planet. And so there might be a shift from very vaguely climate is not a problem to climate is the reason that we need to intensify human management over the planet, and that is a religious mandate that humans have, something like that.
Yeah, so I would second that. As I said, when I was doing interviews with some religious people, they said, I don't represent this branch of my religion, but there's this benevolent dominator kind of subject position that can be brought out through especially Western religion, so sort of saying humanity is a powerful co-creator or a vice regent with specific responsibilities on the planet, no? Based on the understanding that humanity is, the most intelligent being, God-given intelligence, and the only one with the ability for self-reflection, and sort of puts humans in a position of power relative to nature. Humanity is something separate from nature. It can and it must exercise domination over nature to fulfill its destiny and prosper. So this kind of narrative about humanity as a powerful, second only to God.
I mean, but this is
sorry. Can I ask something about the book, because it seems depending on the kind of like the scale and the size of the proposals. Any kind of climate measure could be seen as kind of like from one interpretation, kind of a domineering arrogance, or it could be seen as an instance of wise stewardship. So we could even see, adding to your point, Miranda, it's not just we could see these things. It's not that these things can be interpreted just as kind of like humans filling their destiny as kind of like the next but also as a form of taking care, trying to take care of the planet after perhaps mismanagement and trying to make up for previous mistakes. I had a question for Willis as well. I wondered how I wondered whether I think one thing but anyone can answer, but obviously anyone else can answer this too. I wondered about the degree of climate change skepticism in certain religious groups, and how that correlated with the groups who were more who you said were more more amenable to CDR and SRM kinds of proposal?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting social science question that I don't think we have great data on. I mean, even the existing data we have on climate skepticism inside the United States is really complicated to parse. But yeah, and so I just think, I wonder whether something that was focused on CDR would turn up a variation in that relationship, or whether it would be different. And yeah, I'm not sure. You know, I think another thing to track would be the relative vulnerability of the religious communities that are being asked, especially if they're coastal communities. They may have a different view. They may have a different view about how reliable either governments or states or humans more broadly are for managing ocean, especially if they have traditional lifeways that are connected with it, and especially if they have religious, or those traditional lifeways are connected to their religious or spiritual practices. Then that they might consider themselves to be evangelical Christians, but they might have a different view than evangelical Christians in inland, right? I don't think we have any good data on any of that, and I'm really interested in creating it.
If I can chime in here, Willis, I really appreciate your thoughts about the kinds of data we don't have and the many, many interesting research questions we have. I mean, it seems to me that out of the group of us, we could come up with enough great questions for 200 people doing dissertations or postdocs or something, and that's a lot more work than we have time to do, probably. But on this question of evangelicals in America, I'm thinking back to Robin Veldman's really excellent work on this, and I highly recommend her book, The Gospel of Climate Change, to anyone interested in this subject. I think it's just excellent in so many ways. And she points out very strongly the ways that community relationships and power relationships and political relationships have shaped the religious discourse around climate change in the US. And I would presume that that is also the case elsewhere. And so I want to raise that point up to say it's not just like religion coming from on high or some tradition. It's this embeddedness of religion in communities, thinking about politics and power and money and generational differences, as she pointed out, of who should be the next leaders and all kinds of things, as well as theology and values and ethics. So that's one point. Another point from her work, which I found really interesting, and it just kind of rolls around when I'm thinking about these issues, is she found that when talking to a variety of people who were evangelical Christians about the environment and climate change, they would be wary of talking about it in big, like global terms, but they would really focus on keeping their own home or their own neighborhood or their own town clean. And there was a lot of discussion of cleanliness or caretaking. And so when we're talking about CDR, again, I think it's hard to predict what will happen because of all of these factors. But I think if CDR came to be seen as something that was about cleaning up one's own home or maintaining one's local environment, then Willis, based on this research, I could see how it could really take off. But if it was seen as in another framework, it may not be getting as much traction in those communities. But again, that's like the most associative of hypotheses based on now 5 minutes of thinking about this explicit question. I mean, I've been studying it much longer, but I haven't particularly thought about evangelicals relating to CDR so much.
There was some good spitballing, Sarah. We liked it. Thanks. And I see that Johanna has her hand up, although it's almost the same color as your background. So thanks, Claire, for pointing it out. I might not have seen it. Please go ahead.
So I just want to notice a few things, which is that I think I'm really resistant to the ways that religion might be talked about in really broad ways, because I find that it's such a localized sort of interpretation in terms of discourses. So, and I'm not negating the importance of understanding the evangelical perspective in America, because I think, especially if we look at like John Dryzek's gray radicalism discourse, right? We see that it's very, very powerful in blocking particularly rural votes, right? So because rural America has an outsized impact on policy, the presence of that gray radicalism discourse has a particular power in terms of its ability to block policy. So I do think we actually need to understand it in some ways more than we need to understand other religious perspectives, because it has a particular thrust in terms of policy direction. But what I'm wondering, and I'm kind of going back to this global South sort of perspective that I was asking about, is, you know, when you start to look at these sort of more localized discourses, it completely changes in terms of the amount of power a particular religious discourse has on local policy, what could or couldn't enable different actions, right? So to take the example of a study we just completed in Cumbria, so Cumbria is a very important place for peatland restoration, and one of the largest peatland areas for CDR. But there is a heritage discourse that says that rewilding or regenerative farming that might capture some of this is against our heritage, right? Our heritage is sheep farming. It's the UNESCO World Heritage Site. And so there is a particular sort of broad discourse around that also captures the sort of Anglican, a traditional Anglican perspective, right? So I'm just using that to say, how do we develop an understanding of the local nuances of discourses and the ways that I really appreciated, Willis, what you were saying about how kind of regardless people are going to apply their religious discourse or apply their religious interpretation towards a particular bent in terms of what they may or may not advocate for. So I'm asking, what sort of questions should we be asking that allow for this localized perspective, and especially that values the fact that those most hurt by climate change are in the tropics or in the global South or in more marginalized communities or in coastal communities, and that those more marginalized places take on a different sort of religious interpretation than those that might be more dominant.
Someone would like to come back directly on that?
Yeah, perhaps briefly. I don't know if this is helpful for anyone, but I come back to again and again to thinking about the how the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services deals with indigenous knowledge and religious perspectives on the human-nature relationship, and if it might be helpful if one is interested in the importance of religious perspectives in the climate change and CDR discourse, to look at how the IPBAS platform addresses such different knowledge systems, belief systems, value systems, and how they try to integrate that in their reports and in their work, and also in the policy recommendations that I do. So just as a general thought.
Yeah, I think that's one element of it. So it's knowledge pluralism, and how do we bring together the different perspectives into a large assessment process. But it's also, I think the other element that Johanna was bringing up was also the global to the local, no? So like down, like getting into the context specific assessment of the desirability, feasibility perspectives on CDR, and I think that's something that we're also grappling with our assessment framework now. So you can how to not only involve a broad range of different knowledge types and integrate those in an assessment process, but how to also link the global to the local, or you know, make sure that the assessment and the debate is happening in a very context appropriate manner. So these are things that are something that we're also thinking about, from not from a religious perspective, but definitely from this knowledge integration and context appropriate assessment processes. someone else want to come back on this? Sarah, please go ahead.
Oh, I hope I've not talked too much, but on this last point, Joanna, I think this is a really important question. And when we're talking about this global to local context or knowledge pluralism, I think one thing that we need to be careful about is that when we're talking about ethics or religion or both in assessing and making decisions, there might need to be openness to change and openness to real dialogue. And I think once in a while, not necessarily people here, but once in a while, people have an attitude of, oh, well, let's get religious people on board with the ideas that we already have, and then they can spread them and be kind of our PR people in a community that we haven't already reached. And I think that that kind of mode can be tempting for a lot of people in environmental realms, but I think it can override and inhibit participatory processes, as you were saying, of the people who are maybe most marginalized or most affected, of all kinds of people who may have really deep environmental knowledge. And so I see this issue as not only being an issue of ethics and religion, but also of political decision making and the kinds of values you think ought to be incorporated into that.
Thanks, Sarah. Other thoughts on? Yeah, please go ahead.
Can I just add a little bit to that? So what Sarah's said was pretty much my answer to the fourth question that was laid out in the document about the specific challenges. It's a few, yes. The idea, social scientists have within academia, social scientists have resisted the idea for a long time that they should be kind of like handmaidens or kind of like the kind of the PR people for natural scientists. And so Sarah, as I understood, is making kind of the similar point. We can't just say, okay, let's let's convince them, let's convince these groups that we've got the answer, and then they can translate it into translate it to their own communities. One of the biggest challenge would be to ensure a genuine dialogue. And there's plenty of initiatives. Some of them work fairly well. Some of them perhaps less well. But the biggest challenge is how to actually get an effective dialogue with effective participation. It's very easy to have participation and consultation processes. There was a court case in Norway over a few years ago about wind farms. So mitigation rather than so conventional mitigation rather than the CDR. But the wind farms were built over Sami territory. And the companies set up consultation processes, but the participation, the kinds of participation, the kinds of consultation participation that went on weren't actually effective or weren't actually genuine. So to achieve genuine participation, which also means being maybe having to be told that that our way's wrong and we have to go back to the drawing board on a particular initiative, that's kind of like the hardest. I think that's one of the biggest challenges to achieve to overcome. And I'd be very grateful if anyone could share any insights about how to do so. The Forsen case in Norway was just completely it seemed to manage to miss all the boxes. I'd be happy to hear about some more positive experiences.
On that note, I was thinking like we could, we've got about 15 minutes left, but we don't want to go too much over time. But we could start thinking a little bit more concretely. What are some ways in which we can practically think about bringing in ethical and religious perspectives and knowledge types into ongoing CDR assessment and policy processes? So we have some ideas about the environmental ethics and how that can be integrated into an assessment framework that maybe Lucas and Liska can also speak a little bit to, but like thinking concretely, not just about ideas in the abstract, but actionable ways in which these types of perspectives can be brought in more concretely. Does anyone have some thoughts on that? Go ahead, William.
Yeah, so I have a couple thoughts. One is, and I think you already have great ideas about this, and basically just like stakeholder engagement, the stakeholder engagement that can include people in their own vocabularies, that's obvious. I want to say two other things. One is my perception is that when high-level policy documents, Lisa, you mentioned IPBES. I think that that most recent assessment report that does have knowledge pluralism, I think that made a big difference, especially because it cited a number of statements, documents, forms of knowledge that are seen as religious or indigenous. And so without saying this is the standpoint for policy, I think it validates people who might otherwise say my views aren't reflected in this kind of initiative. And I think, just broadly that can make a difference even when it doesn't say, and that's what it means for this particular initiative. It like, if you cite the recent pan-Islamic statement, Mizan, it doesn't necessarily say, for or against on this particular intervention, but it does show we recognize that these kinds of views matter for the ways that people would perceive them. And I think that in itself is really helpful. Yeah, so so maybe it is just visibly acknowledging different sources of making sense and evaluating, even while maintaining a kind of openness that doesn't mean that anyone who understands themselves to be a member is going to think what this statement thinks, in the appropriate kind of ways. And I think especially around CDR, it's likely that there could be some kinds of strange overlapping consensus on specific kinds of interventions. And that would be especially interesting to find. Like, for example, Lucas, I was taken with your point, which seems completely right. When there's intentional world alteration, it comes with its own problems. And those problems will map on differently into different kinds of religious and moral frameworks. And so you might end up with, I could imagine overlapping affirmation for a particular regional CDR policy for some who think this is repair of pollution, and for others who think this is an opportunity to extend human dominion over the oceans. And well, that would be interesting, and I guess an inclusion framework should be open to that as well, right? That there might be overlapping consensus on specific interventions that have background irreconcilable disagreements.
Although in the to-be-written paper, we argue that intention really doesn't make that much of a moral difference. In this particular case, at least we think so. But yes, also like coming back to the question, like one thing that I found in our interactions with stakeholders, for example, in Asmalis, where we did this framework, including, among other things, environmental ethics considerations. One thing that we always stressed, and I think we stressed for good reason and hopefully with good effect, was like the conditionality of it all. To say, well, we're coming from these normative perspectives and we're making them transparent. And based on these, we have come up with the following criteria, and maybe based on these criteria, we may come up with the following assessment results in the end. And to make clear that there's like no such thing as this is the environmental ethics perspective, especially not like the environmental ethics perspective, that there's no such thing, but saying like coming from this particular standpoint, which is not a random standpoint. We argue for this standpoint. We think there are good reasons for this standpoint, but coming from this, we end up there. And to highlight this in various formats, I think is a thing worth maintaining.
Yeah, making the evaluative standard or principles that are informing the valuation or the assessment clear is one way in which we can explicitly bring in these dimensions. I think it could also be done with other types of guiding principles that might be drawn from religious perspectives, such as, I don't know, responsibility of care or reparation for past damage or something like that, right? So you could use the same assessment framework with a different underpinning evaluative standard against which you are making the assessment, drawing the results out of the application of the individual indicators. See, that was one way of doing an assessment from a slightly different perspective than we have. All right, and we're coming almost to the end of our time slot. Are there any other questions from our participants? We didn't hear very much from you so far. Please feel free to either put a question in the chat or turn your microphone on and ask us a question directly if you should have any.
I didn't really have any questions. I was just more interested to listen to the discussion. Having been involved in some discussions about ethics before, and not particularly from a religious perspective, which I think we had explored the general ethics issues in our assessment framework. So it's just interesting to see how the religious ones come in as well, or overlap perhaps.
Yeah, that's right. And I think when ours, we will have a meeting, right, Chris, soon to think through our assessment framework some more. So maybe we need to also think about these elements. All right. Are there any final comments from the panel that you'd like to add? Anything? Any final thoughts? Any epiphanies that you had during the conversation? Things that I didn't ask you that you wanted to be asked, so that you could say your little spiel.
Did you use the word epiphany intentionally?
I did, actually. I was very proud of it.
That's very good. That's very good. If I may, one that, well, I've just noted, I've just realised we haven't discussed we've only kind of like touched on two kinds of concepts which might also be relevant in discussions about MCDR and other climate response measures. I can't remember. One was the idea of pollution, which often can have very, very kind of spiritual or religious overtones, and the other concept is forgiveness. I don't know if these have been explored in other work, but it just kind of occurred to me after listening to everyone that I haven't come across much work which talks about CDRs or anything else from using these kinds of concepts. So I'd be interested if anyone knows any work that does.
I am not aware, Sarah.
So off the top of my head, I don't know these particular topics with CDR. I do know some about them with respect to environmental or climate change in general. I think some of the best work I've seen on pollution as a religious theme has focused on religions of India. and the ways that pollution, particularly of water, is a very deep religious topic. In that water is often, in particular rivers or bodies of water, are often seen as very cleansing. And then this can lead to some intellectual and cultural challenges when that body of water is polluted in a scientific environmental sense, and the various perspectives that local people will have about whether this sacred body of water is actually polluted, if it still has purifying consequences, etc. So while that hasn't been directed towards CDR that I know of, I think that it could be helpful for this sort of conversation. And then the work on forgiveness, I've started to see, and maybe I need to toot my own horn just a teeny bit. I have looked at climate apology and forgiveness a little bit. And what does that mean on kind of a global, long temporal scale? It's an ongoing question for me. And I know some other people like Ernst Conradi have done work on that. And I see some other things in the chat. So those are some resources I would look at.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. That's amazing. Yeah. All right. We really do have to wrap up now. I have really enjoyed this conversation, and we didn't get through all of the questions that we had thrown on up on the screen, but I think it's important that we just followed the flow of the conversation. I wanted to make this a little bit less structured than some of the other sessions that we've had in the past. Thanks everyone for joining. I would, for those who are not already part of our working group on carbon removal, I've put a link in the chat. You can email me or Sean, who's also on the call. We're the co-coordinators of the working group. We try and organize each time there's an Earth System Governance conference, whether it be online or virtually, as it was this time. We try and organize conversations like this or around other related CDR issues. So please join the mailing list if you're interested in keeping in touch. And I really enjoyed this conversation between ethics and religion. And I think we came up with some. I hadn't thought about the idea of forgiveness, or which may be actually connected to things like historical responsibility for emissions and legacy emissions. So these kind of things emerge organically in conversations like this, which I think it's why it's nice to have a less structured conversation. Sometimes they just they pop up and you're like, wow, I never thought of that. So thank you very much. I really appreciated the conversation, and I hope we can continue it. And Johanna has said there's a connection between the SDG task force. Yes, that would be wonderful. We keep in touch across the ESG ecosystem. Unfortunately, at this time, I think there was a cross-working group sort of event that I wasn't able to join, unfortunately. Next time when we meet in person, then for sure we will engage more across the working groups. So thank you from my side. Have a wonderful morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you may be. And let's keep in touch and continue the conversation again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you, Miranda. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.